Here's an NAR settlement question. How will buyer's agents get paid?
Chris, I think this is a really hot question right now simply because there's so much misinformation and disinformation out there about what does this actually mean to real estate agents and how am I as a buyer's agent still going to get paid? Here's what the settlement proposal actually says is that it's not taking away the ability for listing brokers to compensate buyers brokers.
Mm.
It's not. It is simply removing from the MLS the ability to communicate and advertise what we are willing to pay buyers brokers.
All right.
That's it.
So what you're saying is buyer's agent compensation, it's not prohibited. It's just prohibited from being communicated on the MLS.
That
So
is it. And so what does that mean though? Like, how will we still get paid? We will still get paid potentially in the same manner.
mm,
However, I will put this caveat, Chris. What if maybe a seller says, I don't want to pay the buyer's broker out of this commission?
mm.
Well, then what that means is that we as buyer's agents, this is a second huge part of the lawsuit settlement agreement proposal, is that buyer's agents must have buyer representation agreements with their clients
Mm.
that clearly indicates how they're going to get paid. So, how will buyer's agents get paid? Likely, in my assessment, is that it is still going to continue to be compensated in the manner in which it is being compensated. And if not, if a seller chooses not to pay for a buyer's agent or broker to bring a buyer to their home, that compensation will happen outside of the agreement with the seller.
And there's a lot of options for that, right? And this is not necessarily a new thing. If you have ever worked to show your buyer an expired listing, a withdrawn, a
Or a
FISBO,
FISBO.
right? You would have had to work out compensation with that buyer directly. It's just the normal pattern of what you may have been used to. There may be a few steps in between understanding how exactly are you going to get compensated. How do I talk to buyers about my compensation as a buyer's agent?
So this is a really good question because if you are in a state where buyer representation agreements are not required, or if you work with a broker where they are not required, this may be very new to you.
Mm,
In my communications and my conversations with my buyers, I always discuss how I get compensated. I always discuss a buyer representation agreement and I always discuss my compensation and where it's coming from. So, how do you talk to them? One is you've got to make sure that you build trust
mm,
before you have this conversation. This is not a conversation where somebody walks into an open house and it's like, bam, let's talk about how you're going to pay me if we go and represent you to
mm.
buy a different house. No, no, no. We must build trust with our clients before we have this conversation. So that's number one, is building trust. Next is having conversations around our value. So
Mm.
articulating our value. We've got to make sure that we articulate our value very, very well. Otherwise, why would they want to pay us
Mhm.
if the listing broker's not going to compensate our broker? Why? We have to explain why. And so, how do you talk with your buyers? By using a process, by using a procedure, by using systems and tools and techniques that are designed to build trust with them before you go in for what we call the kill. And that is, please sign here.
So, in the process of getting that buyer's representation agreement signed, which is ultimately where you're going to talk about that compensation, is when you get to those points in your buyer's representation agreement, there's going to be options listed out there, right? But to your point, you need to have an effective process to start building trust, start communicating your value, setting those expectations. For us, what that means is we're going to have an initial consultation long before we meet with that customer. For us, that means we're going to send them some information in our pre-presentation so that we can begin showing our value, so that we begin letting them see, here's what it's like to work with me, and here's why you want to work with me, right? We always have to give people concrete reasons, whether buyers or sellers, concrete reasons why they need to hire us and compensate us for the work that we do. And then the third part, for our process is ultimately having a buyer presentation. Think of that as a listing presentation, but geared towards your buyers long before you're showing any homes, long before you're showing any properties. And so once you have that process to establish trust, only then can you begin to talk about your compensation. Only then can you begin to talk about your fees. How do I explain my value to buyers?
So explaining value starts long before we actually start talking like this. Explaining value, it really starts. It begins in the initial conversation. So that initial conversation of explaining your value to your buyer is around first the initial phone consultation. That's where we discuss what the needs, the wants, the concerns, the desires, and the fears, the buying opportunity, the buying value, etc., that our clients have around this. That is where it all begins.
Mm.
So I think it's important to understand that there's an entire process of explaining that value to the buyer, but it's a process of building trust. Chris, you and I talk about building trust all the time. And the wonderful news about working with buyers is we have an entire system and process designed around that trust building process.
Gary, when I think of how we should be communicating our value to buyers, I think first we have to dispel the old notion of what our value is. I think a lot of real estate professionals thought their value was somehow connected to the MLS. It was being this gatekeeper of information, which, that model has gone away a long, long time ago, right? And so why is it that a buyer would want to work with us? Well, we have to remember that we are the value. We are the expertise that they are hiring. We are the market knowledge that they are hiring. We are the one who is going to help them really define the criteria and help them find the lifestyle that they're looking for when they're going about this home search process. We're the one who's going to negotiate the deal and try to get them the best terms, right, for the situation that they're looking for. So we have to have a really good way to start showing people that value proposition, because just saying those things, that's okay, but it's not nearly as good as experiencing them before you're having a conversation about your compensation, before you're having to go show homes, or before you're even asking to sign that listing, or excuse me, that buyer's representation agreement. And I think your process for having that initial consultation, sending information before meeting with them in person, and then having that buyer presentation accomplishes showing them that experience of what it's like to work with me, so they clearly understand what your value proposition is, and you don't have to explain it.
No, and you know what? I love this quote, Chris. Is a master salesperson never tells anybody anything that they can show them. So we're going to show them our value. We're going to show them how we work with them and show them the value in what I'm bringing to the table, and then how I'm being compensated for that. And that's all part of the entire process.
What if my buyer can't afford my fees as a buyer's agent if the seller isn't offering compensation on that listing?
This is a big question right now, is that what if the seller's not offering this and my buyer can't afford it? This is a real thing, especially when you're dealing with VA buyers, especially when you're dealing with first-time home buyers. Well, actually, almost any home buyer is not they're not going to want to pay that fee, because historically that fee has been paid by the seller's broker. And so what if the seller's broker isn't offering it? Well, there's an easy way that we can include this into the transaction. And right now, what the NAR settlement is offering us is that we as buyer's agents can negotiate that fee in ways of seller contributions to buyer's closing costs. So it's basically called a concession fee, where we negotiate that we, as the buyer, will pay this amount for your home. In addition to that, we want the seller to contribute this amount of money to the buyer's closing costs. And that is a way that the NAR settlement proposal is offering us ability to still collect our fees without the buyer coming out of pocket, like out of pocket. I mean, it's still coming out of pocket through the loan, but not out of their own personal pocket right now. They're amortizing that over the loan.
So basically, what we can do is to request seller concessions, and that's to cover closing costs. That could be inclusive of our fees, could be inclusive of inspections and appraisals and all that stuff.
And lenders' fees and all kinds of closing costs. Yeah,
I think perhaps in the hot market that existed, seller concessions maybe weren't as popular, but like they are a thing, and it's pretty normal to request concessions, especially after like you do the inspection and there's things that are wrong with the house. You might ask for some concessions to make repairs, right? And so this is not different. And this is actually, I think, the one thing that's in the NAR settlement that's very clear is you can request seller concessions. It's just this: the seller concessions cannot alone be based on the use of or payment to a buyer's agent, right? So you can't say in there, oh, in the seller concessions, you have to pay the buyer's agent fee or anything along those lines, right? It has to be lumped together with all those closing costs. This one almost seems a little, I don't know, it seems like a weird thing to ask, but I've seen this pop up in a number of Facebook groups, and it's this: what if the buyer, let's say I'm buying leads. What if my buyer or my buyer prospect or this buyer lead can't afford homes in the market? How will they pay my fees?
Well, so let's back up a step, because before they even get to agreeing to pay your fees, they have to be able to qualify to purchase a home in that market. And what the fundamental question is, what if they can't afford to buy a home in that market? What do I do with them? Well, you don't show them homes.
Don't work with them.
Because here's the thing: if they can't afford to buy a house, what are you doing wasting your valuable time and expertise with somebody who can't even purchase a home? Then, like, we don't even get to how do they pay your compensation, because if they are not qualified to purchase a home, you should not be showing them homes.
I think being very clear in working with people and having a clear understanding of what their goals, what their objectives are, what your goals and objectives are in serving them. And one of those things has to be getting compensated. You can't work for free unless you're choosing to do pro bono work and you're okay with never getting paid. But I think, that question stems from a place of working with people maybe who aren't qualified. And I've actually seen this, right? I've seen people do this where they, because of lack of, maybe they are scarcity, right? They don't have that many leads or they don't have any prospects. So they think that they can work with just anybody who's willing to talk to them. And you really can't afford to do that. And you're wasting your time. What if my buyer, let's say I'm working with a buyer, what if my buyer says they just want to go look at houses without signing a contract, and they suggest that maybe they'll hire me in the future if I work with them now to show them homes?
This is really good, because I think we have two different options here. What we're being posed with this proposed settlement, agreed, it's proposed, is that if this gets passed, what this says is that I am not allowed, as a real estate agent participating in an MLS, to show homes to a buyer without having a buyer representation agreement. So how do I get them to sign an agreement? I think is really what it comes down to. Because if somebody says, well, I don't want to sign an agreement until I get to know you and build trust and see a few homes with you, makes total sense to me, by the way, as a buyer's agent and also as a buyer myself, is that I don't really want to commit to a long-term relationship with a buyer's agent until there's enough trust built. So how do we do that? Well, the way that we do that, and the way that we can do that, is by signing a buyer representation agreement for that day. Signing a buyer representation agreement for a specific home, so that, yes, we are representing them. Yes, we are adhering to the law that this proposed settlement is should be passed by. And so what we're doing is we're making sure that we're adhering to that law. And then, so what do? Well, we build trust with them in person if we have not followed a buyer representation trust building process. So if a buyer just says, look, even if we go through the trust process and they're not willing to sign a long-term buyer representation agreement, heck, get it signed for that day, go show them homes, build trust, and then at the end of the day say, Chris, I don't know about you, but I really feel like we're a good fit for one another, don't you? Chris says, yes, I think we do. Great. Let's go ahead and sign a long-term agreement so I can get to work for you.
Gary, I could see this happening in a very fast market when maybe homes are coming up on the market and then coming off really quickly. And a buyer might say, hey, I'd love to get to know you. I'd love to meet with you and all those great things. But this home I need to go see right now. And so what you're proposing is, hey, here's a quick solution for that situation. Now, the ideal situation is where you have an initial consultation, you send them information, you have a buyer presentation, which is a listing presentation for buyers, right? Where you're explaining your value, you're communicating and articulating your value while setting those expectations so that you can get that buyer's representation agreement signed so that you can discuss your compensation and they trust you and want to do so, right? But when you have to bypass the process out of, and that could be a number of reasons, the speed of the market, well, I think having that solution allows us to make sure we're following the regulations, following the rules, if we're going to participate in the MLS, which we need to have that buyer's agreement signed. But
Well, and
then,
this is a great solution, Chris, as well, is if I, as a listing agent or working for my listing broker and I'm hosting an open house,
mm,
what if that buyer wants to go see a house down the street? Well, what does the proposed settlement say? I must have a buyer representation agreement signed with them.
mm,
Well, so how do I do that if I don't even have time to go through that process? They want to go see the house right
I
now,
know.
darn it. And so the easiest way to do that is by a single property buyer representation agreement where, Chris, I represent you only on this home.
Mm.
And then after that home, then we build trust.
How will this change how we host and conduct open houses and how we work with buyers at an open house?
Oh, this is a great question because let's assume that I'm hosting my own open house or an open house that is represented by my brokerage.
Mhm.
Well, in those situations, I represent the seller. And so as buyers come in, it's reminding them I represent the seller and having conversations with them, not representing them, but representing the seller. But part of my goal as a listing agent at that open house is to convert some of these buyer prospects to buyers.
Mm,
And part of my open house process, if you follow that, is that I'm going to work to show them other homes as well.
mhm.
Because if that house that I'm hosting open is not a great fit for
Which
them,
statistically it won't be, right? I mean, the chances
statistically
of
it
that
won't.
home
And
being the
so,
one is not most likely
right. And
not.
so my goal is to offer them different options. But how does that happen if I've not built trust with them and they want to go see a house down the street this afternoon after
Mm,
my open house is over? The way we can do that is to have one of two things. Number one is a very short term buyer representation agreement. I still must have them sign a buyer representation agreement. But if we're just going to go see one, two, or three homes that day, I can have a buyer representation agreement for that day in order to show them those homes.
mm,
That's one option. Option number two is if your broker will agree with this and approve it, is an easy out clause
mm,
in the buyer representation agreement, which allows the buyer at any time of working with us prior to signing an offer to purchase a home, they can terminate their agreement with us.
mm,
And so both of these options allow that buyer like a temporary time to test out working with us.
mm.
So that allows me the time necessary to build enough trust with them to get them to sign a long-term buyer representation agreement.
Now, Gary, now I want to get into some detail here on this question because let us say, how would I discuss my compensation in that short-term agreement? What if the seller in the house that they want to look at isn't offering buyer's agent compensation?
Well,
What are
yeah.
the how would you address that type of situation, or leading up to it? How would you talk about the compensation at that open house or in that setting?
So we as real estate agents need to get very, very, very good at discussing compensation so that a buyer has no confusion around where my compensation is coming from. So does it change? No. But the focus of that conversation is less on how I get compensated. It's more on there's an easy way to terminate this agreement through an easy
Mm,
out clause, or this is only short term. If you still want to go look at that house, here is what my brokerage charges for me to represent you. And if the seller's broker is not offering our brokerage compensation, we will need to ask for concessions from the seller, or worst case scenario, you will need to pay my fee.
Or, if it's really a problem for them, they can cancel the agreement with that easy exit clause or that easy out clause that you had mentioned before, and always just get out of it. And if they wanted to submit an offer with somebody else who doesn't mind not getting paid, then that's okay, right? Like they can do that. I think it's more about trying to serve people and make it easy to work with them. easy to experience our value proposition, which is going to be our expertise. It's going to be the market knowledge that we have. It's being able to be that trusted advisor and being able to guide them through even those early stages, right? What if the seller isn't offering compensation? Well, that's going to affect every agent representing them on that home. So the more clarity you can provide and more insight and options that you can provide, you have the opportunity to win them as that customer, right?
What if you are a listing agent and your seller flat out refuses to offer compensation to a buyer's broker?
Well, I would say that the first thing is there's a good chance you haven't followed an effective process for that seller to trust the advice and recommendations and the expertise that you have, right? So, our process, Gary, for working with a seller starts off with an initial consultation where we're beginning to build trust as well as understand what it is that they're motivated by and what their real concerns are, right? Then we send out a pre-listing packet. And what that does is it starts to articulate and show our value and give them concrete reasons why they should hire us, why they should pay our fees, what is the value in working with us instead of somebody else. And then we have that listing presentation where we explain and continue to build on that value, continue to build that trust, and ultimately set expectations so that we can have that signed listing agreement when we're leaving. Now, here's the question, right? Well, what if when we get into the detail and I'm explaining the fees and I'm going through that listing agreement and they just flat out refuse to pay the buyer's agent compensation? Well, at that point, Gary, I think what's happened is there's a good chance that maybe they're missing something. I would ask you, Gary, if someone says that, is that all that different than someone asking you to discount your fees? Is that all that different than someone saying, hey, Gary, I think you're pricing the home too low, right? How would you handle it?
Perhaps I don't want to stage the home. I don't want to prepare the home for market. I don't want to do anything to this house. So what they're basically saying is, I don't want to do what is deemed necessary by you, the professional, to make my home competitive in current market conditions. And so if we're working with somebody like that, we still need to have a response to that because it's completely their right. It's their home. They get to make that choice. It is our job to educate them as to the consequences or potential consequences of those choices that they're making. So if they choose not to prepare or update or repair their home from the marketplace, I understand, seller, why you might not want to do that. We need to understand how this positions your home differently in the marketplace and what you may or may not be able to demand as far as price. And that is no different than offering a buyer agent compensation. It is no different than trying to overprice your home. But like you said, Chris, it all goes back to that trust building process. Is perhaps we haven't done enough to build enough trust, but there still may be sellers asking that question. And so we have to have a very powerful response as to understanding why they don't want to do what we're recommending, and also offer alternative consequences or situations that may arise if they choose that path.
Well, I think in this case, right, it is about, offering that buyer's agent compensation is about making that home more attractive in the marketplace and bringing to that home, to that seller, buyers with highly qualified agents working with them, right? I think that's a very important part of being competitive, is making sure that all people involved are skilled, or at least the professionals are skilled, and that they're being compensated for the work that they're doing. And so by making it more attractive, well, let's look at the converse of that. Let's say the buyer isn't represented at all. Well, the chances of that deal falling apart probably increase if they have no guidance. They're not having a professional work them through everything. They're literally on their own trying to figure it out. Now, as a seller, that means you are working with somebody who could very well get confused, not understand what's going on. The deal could fall apart, right? And that would be a problem, because if the deal falls apart after you've already accepted an offer, well, then the deal falls apart and you actually have to relist the home. But when you relist a home, what happens? Future buyers, they think there's something
They
wrong
want
with
to
the
know,
home.
what is wrong? Why did that home fall off? There must be something wrong with that house.
And whenever there's something wrong with a home, buyers typically, they want concessions, right? They perceive there's risk, so they want to make concessions, usually in the form of a lower price. And so by not offering that buyer's agent compensation, do you see how that could potentially prevent you from achieving your goal in selling the home for the price and timing that you want? That seems pretty reasonable, right? Like I can see how that could affect. And once they acknowledge that that is a potential risk, you can affirm that's a consequence. That's a hard consequence, and I highly recommend that we offer X, whatever that is. But ultimately, right, you have to sit back and say, I want to affirm and reaffirm the consequences of not doing so. But ultimately, I work for you, right?
And
Ultimately, I
it
do
is
work.
your choice, seller. It is ultimately your choice.
Hmm. How do I talk to sellers about my compensation?
Hmm. So this is a really good question, and nothing should have changed for you because of this proposed settlement. But if you are not in a situation where you have historically had the skill or knowledge to understand how to communicate your broker's compensation, this is a great way and a great time to start. So
Hmm.
number one is, first, there are steps leading up to this conversation that need to be had. There's a listing process that is designed to build trust with the seller. So when you get to the conversation of what is your home worth, what is a buyer willing to pay for your house, and here's the listing agreement, let's discuss this. There are processes in place that have to happen before you get to that point. Number one is we have to have a really great initial phone consultation. This can be done over the phone or Zoom, where we really uncover the needs, the wants, and concerns of our clients so that we can understand how to prepare ourselves for a listing appointment. Step number two is make sure that you send out valuable information to them through a pre-listing packet before you show up to the home. Number three is that listing presentation. And so as we show up and we present the value that we bring as listing agents representing our brokers to that home, by the end of these three steps, we should have built enough trust. It's called superior trust, in order to have conversations that are not conflict around what is the home worth and then how do we charge. And in that compensation conversation, we are explaining every paragraph of a listing agreement. And part of that listing agreement is the fee that our brokerage charges to sellers for the value that we bring.
Mm.
And that is the entire process. That is how we discuss what our brokerage charges. And that is how we have our clients agree with that by building superior trust.
Gary, one of the things that I noticed that was a bad habit, and this was more of like a hot market dynamic where, a seller might call us and just ask us, hey, what do you charge for selling a home? And, you would be doing yourself and them a major disservice by just saying, I charge whatever, because you haven't given them reasons why to hire you. You haven't given them reasons to understand why you charge what you do, because if they don't know what you do, any number is going to sound like it's too much, right? So you have to educate them on all the things that you do, which is why we have a process for doing that. Let me ask you this though, Gary. Let's say, let's say you have this process and you're discussing your fees. Do you talk about, and how do you talk about compensating the buyer's agent as part of that compensation?
Absolutely. So part of my listing agreement includes, so it says this is what our brokerage charges. And then a subheading of that says, if a buyer is represented by a buyer broker, of this fee that we charge you, we compensate the buyer's broker this amount.
Mm.
And it's just a factual statement. It's like we compensate them for the work that they are doing to bring a qualified buyer to purchase your home and to represent them throughout the transaction.
Mm.
This is a way that we make your home even more marketable in today's landscape.
Mm.
And so what I find is, at that point, by building superior trust, they get it. They
Mhm.
trust me, and they understand that I am going to do the best that I can to represent them as a seller to bring them the best qualified buyer potentially to purchase their home.
I think so much of communicating our fees is starts with communicating value, and then showing and setting expectations. But it is also having the skill to discuss our fees objectively and not have so much emotion tied up into it, right? I
You
think that's
have
one.
to remove any emotional charge from money.
Mm,
And here's the best way to do that: become that professional.
mm,
Because as you become a professional who is representing sellers to the best of your ability, you believe that you are worth that fee.
mm.
When you believe that you are worth the fees that you are charging, it is much easier for a client to believe that you are worth the fees that they are going to pay you.
Mm.
So that is step number one. You have to believe it, and the way you believe it is because you are that professional. Why did the National Association of Realtors decide to settle?
Well, I think, Gary, the first thing that we have to address, and the first thing that NAR addresses, is that NAR is not admitting to doing anything wrong. They're not admitting that any of their members have done anything wrong, right? This is just a way to protect from like copycat lawsuits, but they haven't done anything wrong. And I think the one thing that they have pointed out is this is a way to move forward from all of
Mhm.
this. But here's the thing. Isn't this the wrong question to be asking in the first place, right? Like,
I think it is. I mean, like, understanding why they settled doesn't really do me any favors. I mean, but by understanding that those are the two reasons, like that makes a lot of sense.
well, I think more importantly, it's what do we do to prepare for the changes coming out of the proposed settlement? That's the question to ask is what practices do I need to adjust? What skills do I need to acquire? Because it really is just a skills acquisition conversation. It's not about, you know, legal stuff or why people settled and so on and so forth and where you stand on the spectrum of, all of that. The important question to ask yourself is what skills do I need given the outcomes of the settlement? Now, we would say that you need the skills of knowing how to build trust effectively with your customers. You need the skill of knowing how to articulate your value and show your value and give your clients and prospects concrete reasons why to hire you and to pay your fees. We would say that you need the skills of setting expectation and being able to negotiate and represent your customer. Those are the skills to focus on. Those are the questions to ask yourself.